Hi guys, Tip here. So today we are reading Chapter 5 of Ranger's Apprentice by John Flanagan. It was long after midnight. The flickering torches around the castle yard had begun to burn low again. Will had watched patiently for hours, waiting for the moment when the light was uncertain and the guards were yawning. In the last hour of their shift, the day had been one of the worst he could remember. While his yearmates celebrated, he enjoying their feast and then spreading their time in light-hearted horseplay through the castle and village. Will had slipped away to the silence of the forest, a kilometre or so from the castle. There in the dim green coolness beneath the trees, he spent the afternoon reflecting bitterly on the events of the choosing, nursing the deep pain of disappointment, and wonder what the ranger's paper said. As the long day wore on, and the shadows began to lengthen in the open fields beside the forest, he came to a decision. He had to he had to know what was on the paper, and he had to know tonight. Once night fell, he made his way back to the castle, avoiding villages and castle folk alike, and secured himself in the branches of a fig tree again. On the way, he slipped unnoticed into the kitchens and helped himself to bread, cheese, and apples. He munched moodily on these, barely tasting them. As the evening passed and the castle began to settle down for the night, he observed the movement of the guards, getting a feeling for their trimming as they went on their regular routines. In addition to the guard troop, there was a sergeant on duty at the doorway of the tower that led to Baron's Aldrin's quarters. He was overweight and sleepy, and there was little chance that he would pose a risk to Will. After all, he had no intention of using the door or the stairs. Over the years, his instabile curiosity and penchant for going places where he wasn't supposed to had developed within him, and a skill of moving across seemingly open spaces without being seen. As the wind stirred up the upper branches of the trees, they created moving patterns in the moonlight, patterns that Will now used to great effect. He instantly matched his movements to the rhythm of the trees, sorry, blending easily into the patterns of the yard, becoming part of it, and so being concealed by it. In a way, the lack of obvious cover made his task a little easier. The fat sergeant didn't expect anyone to be moving across the open space of the yard, so no one expected to see anyone. He failed to do so. Breathless, Will flattened himself against the rough stone of the tower wall. The sergeant was barely 5 meters away, and Will could hear his heavy breathing, but a small buttress in the wall hid him from the man's sight. He studied the wall in front of him, craning back to look up. The Brandon office window was a long way up, and farther around the tower to reach it. He would have to climb up and then work his way across the face of the wall to a spot beyond the point where the sergeant stood guard, then up again to the window. He licked his lips nervously. Unlike the smooth inner walls of the tower, the huge blocks of stone that comprised the tower outer wall had large gaps between them. Climbing would be no problem. He'd have plenty of foot and handholds all the way up. In some places, the stone would have been worn some smooth by the weather over the years, he knew, and he'd have to go carefully. But he climbed all the other three towers at some time in the past, and he expected no real difference with this one. Well, no real difficulty with this one. Sorry, guys. Uh, these braces are making it hard to read. But this time, if he were seen, he wouldn't be able to pass it off as a prank. He would be climbing in the middle of the night to a part of the castle where he had no right to be. After all, the Brandon didn't post guards on the tower for the fun of it. People were supposed to stay away unless they had business here. He rubbed his hands together nervously. What could they do to him? He over the choosing. Nobody wanted him. He was commended to a life in the fields already. What could be worse than that? but there was a nagging doubt at the back of his mind. He wasn't absolutely sure that was commended to that life. A faint spark of hope still remained. Perhaps the Brandon would relent. Perhaps if Will pleaded with him in the morning and explained about his father and how important it was for him to be accepted for Balschool, there was a very faint chance that his wish would be granted. And then once he was accepted, he would could show his eagerness and dedication, would make him a worthy student until his growth spurt happened. On the other hand, if he were caught in the next few minutes, not even the small chance would remain. He had no idea what they would do to him if he were caught, but he could be reasonably sure that it wouldn't involve being accepted into Baskel. He hesitated, needing some slight extra push to get him going. If it was the fat sergeant who provided it, Will heard the heavy intake of breath, the shuffling of the man's steady boots against the flagstone as he gathered his equipment together. And he realized that the sergeant was about to make one of his irregular circulations of his beat. Usually, this entailed going a few meters around the tower to either side of the doorway, then returning to his original position. It was more for the purpose of staying awake than anything else, but Will realized that it would bring them face within the next few seconds if he didn't do something. Quickly, easily, he began to swarm up the wall. He made the first 5 meters in a matter of seconds, spreading out against the rough stone like a giant four-legged spider. Then, hearing the heavy footsteps directly below him, he froze, clinging to the wall in case some slight noise might alert the sentry. In fact, it seemed that the sentry had heard something. He paused directly below the point where Will clung, peering into the night, trying to see past the dabbling moving shadows cast by the moon and the swing trees. But, as Will had thought the night before, people solemnly look up. The sergeant, the sergeant, eventually satisfied that he had heard nothing significant, continued to march slowly around the tower. That was Will chance. That was the chance Will needed. It also gave him the opportunity to move across the tower face so that he was directly below the window he wanted. Hands and feet finding purchase easily, he moved almost as fast as a man could walk, all the time going higher and higher up the tower. At one point he looked down, and that was a mistake. Despite his good head for heights, his vision swarmed slightly as he saw how far he had come, and how far below him the hard flagstones of the castle yard were. The sergeant was coming back into view, a tiny figure when seen from this height. Will blinked a moment of vertigo away and continued to climb, perhaps a little more slowly and with a little bit more care than before. There was a hard, sorry. There was a hard stopping moment when he stretched his right foot to a new foothold. His left foot slipped on the weather-rounded edge of the massive building blocks. As he was left clinging by his hands alone, and he desperately scrabbled for a foothold. Then he recovered and kept moving. He felt a surge of relief as his hands finally closed over a stone window ledge, and he heaved himself up and into the room, swinging his legs over the sill and dropping lightly inside. The Brandon was The Brandon's office was deserted, of course. The three-quarter moon streamed light in through the big window. And there, on the desk where the Brandon had left it, was the single sheet of paper that held the answer to Will's future. Nervously, he glanced around the room. The Brandon's huge, high-backed chair stood like a sentry behind the desk. Few other pieces of furniture loomed dark and motionless. On one wall, a portrait of one of the Brandon's ancestors glared down at him accusingly. He shook off these painful thoughts and crossed quickly to the desk, his soft boots making no sound on the bare boards of the floor. The sheet of paper, bright white with the reflecting moonlight, was within reach. Just look at it, read it, and go, he told himself. That was all he had to do. He stretched out his hand for it. His fingers touched it, and a hand shot out of nowhere and seized him by the wrist. Will shouted aloud in fright. His heart leapt into his mouth, and he found himself looking up into the cold eyes of Halt the Ranger. Where had he come from? Will had been sure that there had been nobody else in the room, and there had been no sound of a door opening. Then he remembered how a ranger could wrap himself in a strange maudlin green-gray cloak, and of his, and seemed to melt into the background, blending up with the shadows until he was invisible. Not that it mattered now. Mattered how Holt had done it. The real problem was that he caught Will here in the Brennan's office, and that meant the end of to all of Will's hopes. Thought you thought you might try something like this, said the ranger in a low voice. Will's heart pounded from the shock of the last few moments. Said nothing. He hung his head in shame and despair. Do you have anything to say? Holt asked him, and Will shook his head, unwilling to look up and meet that dark, penetrating gaze. Holt's next words confirmed Will's worst fears. Well, let's see what the Brandon thinks about this, he said. Please, Holt, not. Then he stopped. There was no excuse for what he had done, and the least he could do was face his punishment like a man, like a warrior, like his father, he thought. The ranger studied him for a moment. Will thought he saw a brief flicker of recognition. The dark eyes darkened once more. What? Will asked scarcely. Will shook his head. Nothing. The ranger's grip was like iron around his wrist, and he held Will out the door and onto the wide, curving staircase that led up to the Brandons' living quarters. The sentries at the head of the stairs looked up in surprise at the sight of the grim-faced ranger and the boy beside him. At a brief signal from Holt, they stood aside and opened the doors into the Brandon's apartment. The door was brightly lit, and for a moment Will looked around in confusion. He was sure he had seen the lights go out on this floor while he had waited and watched in the tree. Then he saw the heavy drapes across the window and understood. In contrast to Brandon's sparsely furnishing working quarters below, this room was a comfortable clutter of settles, footstraps, carpets, tapestries, and armchairs. In one of these, Brandon Aldrin sat reading through a pile of reports. He looked up from a page he was holding as Holt entered with his captive. So you were right, said the Brandon, and Holt nodded. Just as I said, my lord. Came across the castle yard like a shadow, dodged a sentry as if you weren't there, and came up the tower wall like a spider. The Brandon set the report down on a side table and leaned forward. He climbed the tower, you say? He asked, a trifle incredulously. No rope, no ladder, my lord. Climbed it as easily as you get on a horse in the morning. Easier, in fact, he said, with just a ghost of a smile. The Brandon frowned. He was a little overweight, and sometimes he needed help getting on his horse after a late night. He obviously wasn't amused by Holt's reminding him of the fact. Well, now, he said, looking sternly at Will, this is a serious matter. Will said nothing. He wasn't sure if he should agree or disagree. Either course had its dangers, but he wished Holt hadn't put the Brandon in a bad mood by referring to his weight. It certainly wouldn't make things any better for him. So, what shall we do with you, young Will? Brandon continued. He rose from the chair and began to pace. Will looked up at him, trying to gauge his mood. The strong, bearded face told him nothing. But Brandon stopped his pacing and fingered his beard thoughtfully. Tell me, Will. Tell me, young Will, he said, facing away from the miserable boy. What would you do in my place? What would you do with a boy who broke into your office in the middle of the night and tried to steal an important document? I wasn't stealing, my lord. The denial burst from Will before he could contain it. The Brandon turned to him, one eyebrow raised in apparent disbelief. Will continued weakly. I just wanted to see it, after all. That's all. Perhaps so, said the Brandon. That eyebrow still raised. But you haven't answered my question. What would you do in my place? Will hung his head. He could plead. He could apologize. He could ask for mercy. He could try to explain. But then he squared his shoulders and came to a decision. He had known the consequences of being caught, and he had chosen the had no right now to plead for forgiveness. My lord, he said hesitatingly, knowing that this was a decisive moment in his life. The Brennan regarded him, still half turned face from the window. Yes, he said, and Will somehow found the resolve to go on. My lord, I don't know what I would do in your place. I do know there is no excuse for my actions, and I will accept whatever punishment you decide. As he spoke, he raised his face to look the Brennan in the eye, and doing so he caught the Brennan's quick glance to Holt. There was something in his glance he saw, strangely. It was almost a look of approval or agreement. Then it was gone. Any suggestions, Holt? Brennan asked, in a careful, neutral tone. Will looked at the ranger now. His face was stern, as it always was. The grizzled gray beard and the short hair made him seem even more disapproving, more ominous. Perhaps we should show him the paper he was so keen to see. My lord, he said, producing the single sheet from inside his sleeve. The Brandon allowed a smile to break through. Not a bad idea, he said. I suppose in a way, it does spell out his punishment, doesn't it? Will glanced from one man to the other. There was something going on here that he didn't understand. The Brandon seemed to think that what he just said was rather amusing. Holt, on the other hand, wasn't sharing in his fun. If you say so, my lord, he replied evenly. The Brandon waved a hand at him impatiently. Take a joke, Holt. Take a joke. Well, go on and show him the paper. The ranger crossed the room and handed Will the sheet he had risked so much to see. His hands trembled as he took it. His punishment. How, but how had the Brennan known he deserved punishment before the actual event? He realized that the Brennan was watching him expectantly. Holt, as ever, was an impassive little statue. Will unfolded the sheet and read the words Holt had written down there. The boy, Will, has potential to be trained as a ranger. I'll accept him as my apprentice. Well, guys, that is chapter 5 of Ranger's Apprentice. Sorry, guys, for my staggering. I need a drink of water. Oof. That was a long chapter. Like and subscribe if you want more, and just gonna remind you guys that I will be doing a live broadcast at the final 5 chapters for just finishing the book because it's super exciting and everything. So see you next chapter. Bye guys. Like and subscribe.